in the way that we see things. Ephesians 6 and 7 talks about how this we're describing. He says we serve wholeheartedly. He says he says do the will of God from your heart. It's that idea of heart, and wholeheartedly is out of love that you serve, out of love that you do your work that's before you, and you approach it that way. Colossians 3:22, same thing. It's a sincerity of the heart that we have reverence for the Lord that has been speaking there. Then it's in that then we understand that every single piece of work must be good enough to show God when you think about that. I can think of times where it's like, you know what, that's good enough. When I was in work, I never in the church, but real estate, No, it's been here too, so I'm just joking with you. The expression here, actually in this passage here, when he says, he talks about the eyes, there was an expression used that was serving the eyes, where you serve, but really what you're doing is you're serving what people see, and what they don't see. When they turn their back, you act differently. Do you do that? At work, you act one way when the employer's in the room, and then when he leaves, you act differently. Or maybe, how about this? On the freeway, you drive one speed when the police are around, but you drive different speed when they're not there. We all do it. Where we're serving the eyes is what's really being said here, where our behavior is based on the person around us and how we'll act and what we'll do. And Paul is saying, no, that's not what you do. What Paul says is you serve and you act in a way that whatever you do, you are bringing it to God and saying, here, this is what I did today, God. What do you think? Alyssa will come home, as all you kids do, come home with homework from school, and you'll say, hey, Mom, Dad, this is what I did at school. You're proud of what you did, and you want to show it to them. That's the way it should be at our work. Whatever we do, forget the owner, forget the boss, forget any of that, forget your coworkers who say, hey, slow down, man, you're going to make us all look bad. Forget all that. You do it because you say, you know what, at the end of the day, I go to God and say, this is what I did today, God. Take a look. Obviously, he sees it way ahead of time. But that's what we need to be able to, mindset we need to think about. Some companies are run that way. In-N-Out Burger, for example, you guys all know, maybe. But they don't give people minimum wage. Kids, they're a higher wage. They have one of the lowest turnovers as a company because they behave in their company structures in a way where they treat their employees with great respect. It's a Christian organization. If you ever noticed, Bible verse in the bottom of the ring of the cup, that is there. And that's not the point that, I'm not an In-N-Out Burger person. My family is, but it's like, I like Burger King. But hey, I can't stand their commercials, so In-N-Out's okay. But it's a company who respects their employee that says, look, I value my employee in a way that they deserve to be treated with respect. That what I do with my employee stands before God to be able to say, good job. And if I know that it's not, if I want to undermine and get the best out of them, then it's like, no, that's not going to stand the test of being before God. It's a matter of kind of an integrity that places in there. And so that's where it's an opportunity. Those are acts of worship because you do it as a worship to God in the way that we act. And so therefore we measure our work by God's pleasure, not man's pleasure. What Paul's saying here to people is slaves back then were known as being very lazy and hey, why wouldn't they be? Because, there's no reward in it. I just do it because you tell me to do it. You own me. But they're not motivated by any pay or any kind of reward. And so, they could, and certainly being mistreated. And so the question is, he says, hey, don't act in a way that, you look good as your employee. It's what you do when the employee's not there. Isn't that what integrity is? What you do when no one's looking? I think integrity is what you do when God's looking. And so the comment here is really to say, look, no employee should ever be concerned with you, or employer should be concerned with you about saying, well, I wonder what Mark does when I'm not around. Because to an employer, you'd say, hey, you know what? Quite frankly, your bar is way too low. I'm doing it for God, and what I do for God is just blowing you out of the water. I'm not here to please you. I'm here to please God, and I know you'll be very pleased if I go to please God. That's the one that we look. It's the same thing to an employee. Is I don't treat you based on what other employers do. I treat you based on what I know God has called me to treat you, and I know you'll be very satisfied because if I treat you the way God would want me to treat you, then I know you'll be pleased. Back then, as I mentioned about slavery, it was really abusive, and and it really poses the question: what do you do when you're mistreated? What do you do when you are in a company where there's injustice and they're treating you wrong? And I should say that nowhere, particularly in business, are we called to do anything illegal or anything like that. Of course, in the day of Paul with slavery, This is where it's different. You didn't have that luxury to say, hey, you know what? Sorry, I'm not going to be a part of your scheme because you were a slave. But 1 Peter 2 speaks to that. 18:21, it says this. It's written in your program. Slaves, it says, submit yourself to your masters with all respect, not only for those who are good and considerate, but also for those who are harsh. For it is commendable of a man bears up under the pain of unjust suffering, because he is conscious of God. But how is it to your credit if you receive a beating for doing good and wrong and endure it? But if you suffer for doing good and you endure it, this is commendable before God. To this you were called, because Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in your steps. It just reeks in this imagery of the fact of this unjust slave being mistreated, recognizing it doesn't matter what my owner does because I'm going to behave in such a way that I know that I please God, regardless of how my employer is. Oftentimes in work, we behave that way because it's like, I don't have another job, so I got to do it. The Christ-centered workplace and work is this imagery of that, I don't agree with them. I don't agree with the way they were treating me. I don't agree with the unfairness in the way that they work. But you know what? When I get up in the day, I do my job because my intent is I am commended by God to please Him by doing the work that He's called me to do. That's what's being described in this. I mean, I think about it, and I think how freeing that would be when you're not getting up every day trying to figure out your employer and all that. You're just going and doing the task that God has given you to do. The motivation is maybe the third thing that really comes in here. The reward we live for comes from God. Paul talks to that to both the employer or the slave and also the master. So also the employee and also the employer for us. He speaks about what's interesting is there's kind of a unique parallel that happens. Keeping in mind that Paul is saying the same thing as he ends it, to a slave and to a master, that all I say applies to both of you. There's no two classes here. It applies to both of you. There's reward for both of you. There's justice, and there's going to be judgment for both of you. And so there's a parallel here, and you can see it in the way that he describes it, where he talks about in verse 8, he speaks first to the slave. He says, you know that the Lord will reward everyone for whatever good he does, whether slave or free. And so he's telling him to serve, he says, knowing you will be rewarded. Because honestly, hey, the thought of reward for a slave, no. But then for them to think that, look, I can live in as bad as this life will be, I know that my Father in heaven is going to reward me for the work that I do, is an encouragement that he gives to slaves. And then also, and then of course it applies to owners as well. But then in verse 9, he talks to the owners, or the masters. He says, treat your slaves in the same way. Do not threaten them. And then he says the same one. He says, because you know. And here he says, since you know. So it means the same thing. He says that he who is both their master and yours in heaven, and there is no favoritism of him. He's referencing about the idea that, and there's about threatening him because there's going to be judgment. In Colossians, it speaks specifically about this idea of judgment. So Paul speaks to both of them, understanding that when it comes to God, in the end here, there is going to give an account. There's going to be an account for the way in which we act and we work that God is going to reward, and there's going to be an account in the way that we act and work that God is going to hold judgment against. That's who we are accountable to. And whether slave or master, whether employer or employee, we need to act according to both and understanding that God is the one who's measuring that. And so we work for the reward that we receive from God. Sometimes we see it in this life. Sometimes we don't. Sometimes there's injustice. We wonder if it'll ever happen. I remember when I got let off from a company that let me go and unfairly done. And I'm thinking, God, I can think of a lot of verses where justice is mine. God, I'm waiting for you to nail them. I don't know that he ever did. I mean, they're not in the Tracy anymore, but I don't know whatever happened to them. But that's his business. I could walk. It was kind of freeing to walk away saying, look, it's not for me to try to be able to figure that out.